So, ladies and gentlemen, we are now starting the afternoon session on finance and climate change. The panel is already on the podium. Governor Visco, whenever you are ready.
Thank you very much. Welcome back. Obviously, starting this afternoon session after this rich lunch will be hard, but I hope this will flow like the sessions we had this morning. Now, the global community is showing, as we have understood from all what has been said up to now, a substantial growing awareness of the dramatic repercussions of climate change. Now, this is clearly increasingly affecting both the economies and the societies where we live. Its financial implications are encouraging financial institutions to use their resources and their catalytic capacity to push for faster change in production and through also an engagement and capital allocation which is somehow green. These developments have provided a major boost, therefore, to the analysis of climate-related risks which elicit further interest within the financial sector. ESG, that is environmental, social and governance scores, had been computed for some time for listed companies for years by specialized institutions. We in the Bank of Italy have used them at length. There is a wide divergence between those who provide these scores, so you have really to pick and choose and be very careful. But now they are carefully considered by investors, and we will hear something about that, I suppose, together with the traditional economic and financial determinants of the creditworthiness of firms. In the last few years, sustainable finance has grown significantly, is now a market trend in its own right, still rather small, I think, but it has showing a substantial growth. In the last few years, it has increased by 60% since 2015. Now, this trend brings potentially large benefits. It stimulates conversion from brown to green activities, but it is not without risks. The key one that we all are familiar with is the greenwashing. That is the funding of activities that appear to be sustainable only on the surface. It is a risk amplified by the lack of a comprehensive and universally accepted taxonomy of sustainable activities. The demand for more and better data to measure the impact of climate change on the economy and on the financial system is therefore strong. Now, central banks, Christine, can play, as you often say, an important role in supporting the transition towards net zero emissions. As financial investors ourselves, central bankers, many of us have started to apply sustainability criteria to our own non-monetary portfolios. As micro and macro prudential supervisors, we need to assess whether intermediaries take climate-related risks sufficiently, so carefully, correctly into account, and whether these risks threaten the overall financial stability. And then we have monetary policy. Certainly, we need to do better to integrate climate risks into our models and operations. This is an issue that at the ECB we have studied carefully during the review of our strategy. As I've noted on other occasions, however, there is now a lot of emphasis on the financial system. Central banks and the financial sector seem to be, I would say, burdened, if I may use that word, with substantial expectations. And the question is whether these expectations are rightly placed, are excessive or not. There is indeed the risk, I think, that disproportionate focus on the financial sector may become somehow an excuse for governments not to act or act less than would be necessary. Finance facilitates investment indeed, but cannot create green assets if there are no productive activity behind these assets. So we must not forget that the primary responsibility of addressing climate change rests first and foremost with the national governments. We have listened to them this morning. There is a variety of approaches. I'd say there is a majority of persons in their capacities as ministers really somehow to push for much more use of carbon pricing, but there is obviously some hesitation on going too far on the tax approach, but clearly it is national governments that have the required democratic legitimacy to apply the most suitable tools, be those the lifting of carbon taxes or making the regulation of greenhouse gas emissions more severe, providing subsidies or removing subsidies on fossil fuels, and tax incentives to green activities. Now we will discuss these and other topics in this session, together with a number of very distinguished speakers, starting with Larry Fink, who is the chairman and CEO of Blackrock, Christine Lagarde, who is the president of the European Central Bank, Paolo Gentiloni, who is the European Commissioner for Economy, and Linda-Eling Lee, who is the global head of ESG research at MSCI. We will then listen to two messages from Shemara Wikramanayake, who is the managing director and CEO of Macquarie, and Alok Sharma, who is the president of COP26. After the coffee break, then there will be Randy Quarles, who is governor, vice chairman of the US Federal Reserve and chair of the Financial Stability Board, who will report on the activity of the working group on data and disclosures, followed by Mark Carney, who is the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance, and he will discuss the proposals of the working group on private sector incentives. So I start without further ado, and I give the floor to Larry Fink. Larry, please. It works.
Good, thank you. Well, what a pleasure to travel again. So in a world of COVID, traveling again is really, it's fun. So I recommend it for everybody. I want to thank the finance minister and the governor for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure. In 1450, the Venetian cartographer Fra Mauro created his Mappa Mundi, the most accurate map ever drawn. He created the map not by drawing it, but he spoke to many people. And through that, he was able to learn from traders and explorers and refugees that were actually out there navigating the world. As we try to draw the map for our pathway to net zero, that's what I'd like to share today, what I've learned from my conversations with conservationists and conversations with and experiences and events over the last couple years. We all know we want to get to a net zero. Now we need a realistic map for how to get there. In 2015, a global consensus emerged in Paris around limiting global warming, ideally to 1.5 degrees, and more recently around achieving a net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Since that milestone, we've seen the physical impact of climate change, whether it is the unprecedented fires from Australia to the American West, to the Amazon, to the flooding here in Venice, around the world. And these physical effects, which will only continue to mount, are playing out in financial terms as well, as they increasingly impact insurance rates, reinsurance rates, and now more and more financial decisions. As an asset manager and a fiduciary to all our clients, Blackrock is at the nexus between the owners of capital and the companies and assets in which we invest on their behalf. That's why I wrote a CEO letter last year about the fundamental reshaping of the economy. I wrote that climate risk is investment risk, and that we would have a profound impact on their businesses and ultimately how investors will evaluate each company and each asset. And that BlackRock and other investors would increasingly be asking for greater transparency. into the ways that climate risk would affect each company's ability to grow, each company's ability to navigate itself, and how they're preparing for the future. Not all industries and companies are moving as fast as we'd like, but I do believe disclosures are improving dramatically, and we're beginning to see a real transformation in the corporate world as more and more companies commit to net zero plans. And I believe we will see continued progress as corporate disclosures, as more governments consider making corporate disclosures more mandatory. But we need greater global consistency in that disclosure, in the rulemaking. We need to put politics aside and create a standard taxonomy for sustainable reporting, or it won't work. Investors need a single standard by which to judge companies. As necessary and useful as some of these steps are, quite frankly, we're just at the easy part. In fact, there'll be nothing more than window dressing unless we begin to take steps that are more comprehensive, that are more long-term across the entire economies. If we hope to be successful in truly making sustainable progress, I see three critical issues that we need to address, and we need to address them now. First, we need to broaden the focus beyond just public companies. There's been a tremendous progress in the public markets recently. 2 years ago, I anticipated a tectonic shift in capital. Well, that shift is happening and just accelerating. Sustainable investing strategies globally saw nearly $400 billion in inflows in just 2020. And we are on track to grow almost twice as quickly this year. I believe that this is the beginning of the most profound transformation in the financial system that I've seen in my 40-plus years in finance. But the shift is happening mainly in public markets and only among public companies. Disclosure has reshaped behavior in dramatic ways. Most of them are really positive. But one negative effect is creating a massive incentive for public companies to divest dirty assets. By some estimates, by the end of the decade, oil and gas companies will divest more than $100 billion of assets. Divesting, whether done independently or mandated by a court, might move an individual company that Blackrock may support more, but the world is not getting any closer to the net zero. We're just moving them. And I think it's going to have the opposite impact of helping the environment. As private and state-owned companies produce a greater and greater share of oil and gas, there will be less scrutiny, less disclosures around global emissions. TCFD, of course, requires public companies not only to disclose their direct emissions, but also emissions throughout a company's supply chain or a bank's lending book. To reduce these Scope 3 emissions, big public companies and banks are now being cast as a role of an emission police, having to cut off businesses or lending to companies, often smaller companies, that have not yet reduced their own emissions. This will have the unintended consequences of fueling a backlash against our big companies, and it will promote a narrative big versus small, and will create greater and greater political polarization. We made important progress getting large companies to move forward. It's been a critical step. And now we need a comprehensive approach that applies to all companies. We need regulatories of all agencies to work comprehensively together so we can have a comprehensive taxonomy for all. And we need to make sure that approach is not just for public companies, but public companies and private companies alike. Second, as we move forward with the energy transition, we need to make sure that we are pushing just as hard on the demand side as we are on the supply side. Otherwise, we risk supply crises that drive up the cost for consumers, especially those who can at least afford, and it will make the transition politically untenable. We all know the political timeline is much shorter than the timeline that we are going to have to achieve. And so we have to find ways to calibrate that timeline. The gap in cost between clean energy and those that emit greater amount of greenhouse gases is still enormous for most things. And we need to be working to bring down the green premium. Rising oil prices will only mean greater dependence on coal in the emerging world. Therefore, we need to manage the supply and demand curve much more effectively. Virtually all the recent focus and real movement has been the supply side, while very little has been done on the demand side. And much of this morning's conversation was about carbon tax. And it works. It may not work politically. In fact, right now, demand for hydrocarbons in 2021 is actually accelerating, driving up energy prices. We're going to have to ask ourselves, especially with political elections coming up, will people accept $100 oil? Will people accept $120 oil in the short term? Will politicians accept that? While some, we see higher prices as a way to constrain demand, rising costs in the energy sector will only sow greater economic inequalities and a world of have and have-nots. This will feed political polarization, and we've already seen how populist leaders can undo years of work and progress with little more than a tweet. The solution has to focus on bringing down the green premium by changing behaviors and making huge investments in new technology while minimizing the stranding of assets. We've seen some progress of closing the green premium by bringing down the costs in the energy and transportation sector, but there are sectors like cement and steel that have been major sources of emission where there has been very little progress in terms of bringing down the green premium. The energy transition is going to require unprecedented investments in new technologies to decarbonize every sector of the economy. 60 years ago, when President John F. Kennedy committed to putting a man on the moon, it seemed like the greatest technological challenge ever undertaken. At the peak of the Apollo program, the US government was spending more than 6% of discretionary spending on the space program. But that moonshot was modest compared to what we have to do to get to a carbon-free economy and the world we face. Yet government's ability to finance it is even more constrained. Right now, almost every government we are seeing with the US infrastructure bill is relying on deficit spending. But deficit spending has its limits, we all know, especially when governments are also spending on the physical impact of climate change and the impact of COVID. If we're going to bring down the green premium, we need to get serious about attracting private capital for technology innovation. We need to approaches that fail to mobilize private capital are not going to be enough to get the job done. A successful transition that does not impose politically unpalatable costs on those who could least afford it, we require that we carefully balance supply and demand. At the same time, we need to mobilize public and private capital to bring down the green premium. Third and finally, and maybe the most important, we need to rethink how we're going to attract necessary capital to facilitate the transition in the emerging world. Economic development in each emerging market is going to depend on how quickly they become green. That will also require enormous capital. There is private capital that can be mobilized for the emerging markets, but we need to rethink the way international financial institutions can support low-carbon investments at scale. The IMF and the World Bank was created nearly 80 years ago based on the model of bank balance sheets. But the global world is very different today. Banks have Basel requirements. They are not the lender to the emerging world anymore. But the IMF and the World Bank have achieved great things and built strong networks and relationships in the emerging markets. But when it comes to unlocking fiduciary assets, pension fund assets, asset owner capital for sustainability, we need to rethink the role of these institutions. The transition of the emerging markets will require on reimagining these institutions for the world of sustainable investing. We need to rethink their model and I would urge that the owners of these institutions rethink in how capital is going to be deployed in the future. We need a financing system that isn't built around bank balance sheets, but one that is built to attract owner capital into sustainable investments in economies that offer long-term durable returns. The green banks that are being established around the world and currently under consideration in the U.S. as part of the infrastructure bill could be a powerful mechanism for accelerating green investments, but that's just not enough money. We need global solutions and international organizations that are willing or can legally mitigate the risks of investing in the emerging world. If we're going to attract what is needed in the emerging world, which is hundreds of billions of dollars of private capital for brownfield investing in other sustainable projects in the emerging world, we need more solutions that have been used historically by the mortgage-backed securities market, where some degree of losses, first loss pieces, are being absorbed before they impact private investors. Blackrock is pleased to have joined in creating the Climate Finance Partnership in conjunction with our government partners, France, Germany, and Japan, as well as philanthropic partners. This is a public-private structure designed to attract private capital for sustainable infrastructure like renewable power in emerging markets. Governments and philanthropic institutions are providing the subordinated capital as a means to provide risk and returns protection that attracts the private capital. Just this past week, we held our first close for this fund. This is the type of public-private partnership we need to provide first loss protection for investors. However, as excited I am about the partnership, we need solutions for a much greater magnitude. And if we don't have international institutions providing that kind of first loss position at greater scale than they do today, properly overseeing these investments and bringing down the cost of financing and cost of equity, we're not going to be able to really attract enough private capital necessary for the energy transition in the emerging world. While these challenges on the journey to net zero are massive, I remain an optimist. And I do believe that the climate transition presents a historic opportunity. By BlackRock's own research, the transition can drive as much as 25% higher cumulative GDP over the next 2 decades alone. And it represents an investment opportunity for long-term investors of as much as $50 trillion. As an asset manager, we know asset owners want to be part of this opportunity, but a lot has to change to make it happen, and so we could achieve it. We need a global, consistent approach that spans both public and private sectors. Each side needs to work together in defining sector-specific pathways for a net zero. We need to do as much as possible to mitigate rising energy prices to ensure a just transition for all stakeholders in the global economy. Careful planning, coordination, action, and continued migration and mitigation of the risks will be the way we can achieve our shared agenda and goals. Broad-based public policy and long-term planning are what's needed to drive change. We all know this is not going to be easy. We need a comprehensive plan. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Larry. Clearly, you spoke as much as an asset manager as somehow putting requests to the MDBs, the IMF, to try to somehow organize a way to convoy the funds that you can get in the private sector. Obviously, you need also to identify the projects which have to be financed by the NDBs and so on. So it's an engagement that really needs to have many, many working together. Let's see on the central bank side what can be done. Christine.
Well, thank you very much, Ignazio, and what a pleasure it is to be participating in this on that stage with eloquent and passionate speakers about the matters that we are all concerned about. Well, I completely agree with Larry that it is a lot of fun actually to see each other and to be in the same physical presence. I think that we are also going to learn a little bit from COVID in measuring our footprint and being sensible about the amount of traveling that we do on an ongoing basis. So this one is an exclusive, very peculiar forum and a meeting initiated by the Italian presidency that really warrants the trip. But I think that we will learn from that COVID period also to actually be mindful about how we travel and what for. This one is definitely worth it. So I don't think I need to spend much time to demonstrate that climate change and the transition to a carbon neutral economy pose substantial challenges for the economy and the financial system, with the potential to affect growth, inflation in the short term, but also over much longer horizon. Having my President of the European Central Bank hat on, I would argue that physical risks, stranded assets, and greater firm default risk expose the financial system to losses which may impair the transmission of monetary policy, which is what we central bankers are concerned about. And the Eurosystem's balance sheet itself is exposed to climate risks from the assets that we hold, notably through our asset purchase programs. Not all central banks purchase assets, but certainly the European system does and the ECB does. Now, some might ask, why would a central bank be bothered about that? Well, I would say in short that climate change has consequences for us as central bankers in pursuing our primary mandate of price stability and our other areas of competence, including supervision and financial stability. And granted, as you, Ignazio, said perfectly sensibly, and as I'm sure other very competent speakers said this morning, it is not the main job of central banks. It is the main job of governments, of parliament, to be responsible for facilitating an orderly transition, and they are the ones who hold the key tools in their hands. But having said that, central bankers, like everybody else, cannot be oblivious to the risks that are out there, especially if they affect their mandate of price stability. So central banks have to ask themselves, whatever they do, in which way they can contribute to reducing the impact of climate change while delivering on their mandate. And as a result, as Governor Visco just indicated, the impact of climate change on monetary policy was a significant element of our strategy review that took place over the last 12 months. And to summarize it briefly around a AAA, we concluded that we had a duty around analyzing, around advising, and around acting. So let me start with the first one. We need to analyze better. And the ECB has been advancing its analysis, quantifying the potential impact of climate on the economy and on the financial system. Let me give you an example that we are conducting now. The results have not yet been published. They will be published later in July. We are conducting an economy-wide climate-related stress test of the financial system. And the exercise assesses the resilience of banks to various climate scenarios that have been produced by the NGFS, and it covers approximately 4 million companies worldwide and 1,600 consolidated banks. So 40 million corporates on the one hand, 1,600 banks on the other hand. We map those gigantic databases to identify what risks the banks are exposed to. And that covers, as you can imagine, all the euro area banks at the moment, or pretty much all of them. Now, let me get quickly to a sort of a preview of the findings that will be published soon. Number one, it's clearly necessary and more beneficial to act early and to ensure an orderly transition. It goes without saying, but it's quite nice to actually produce that as a good and tangible research identification. Number two, while transition costs may be higher in the short term, they are much lower in the long run than the cost of unrestrained climate change. So the immediate cost pale in comparison with the long-term consequences of not doing that and not investing now. 3, physical risks are the most significant source of climate-related vulnerability. And in specific relation to banks, what we've also identified is that without further and deeper climate policies, the most vulnerable 10% of the banks may see a 30% increase in the average probability of default of their credit portfolios between now and 2050. 30% increase. So watch out for that publication. It's a mine of really interesting information. Second thing that we are doing also in the category of better analyzing is that we are accelerating the development of new models and tools to incorporate the impacts of climate change and related policies into our regular monitoring of the economy. We will include carbon prices in our common technical assumptions and update it regularly. We will regularly evaluate the impact of climate policies and improve our modeling of the impact of extreme weather events on output and inflation in the near term and in the longer term estimates of potential output. That's on the analyzing front. On the advising front, we have issued a guide just last year of our supervisory expectations of how banks should manage and disclose these risks. But you know what? A substantial majority of those banks actually, when they audit themselves in accordance with the guidelines that we've given, recognize that they do not meet expectations. The banks themselves found out that 90% of reported practices only partially meet our requirements or do not do it at all. And it's only 20% of the banks that have a systematic way of assessing climate risks. Yet, almost all that do have found climate risks to be already here are having a material impact on their risk profile. So it matters a lot to their risk profile. They do not really report as well as they should, and many of them hardly report as expected. So we continue, and we will continue to encourage them to do so. On a second front, we continue to advocate in European and in international fora for the important precondition of the green transition. I know it was much talked about this morning, an effective carbon price that reflects the true cost of carbon, greater and better climate disclosures. There will be more talked about, I'm sure, under Erki's leadership, and the completion of the EU Capital Market Union. Now, indeed, to deter greenwashing, it is vital that disclosure data are complete, internationally consistent, and auditable. They do not have to be the same and exactly the same across the board, but they have to be consistent and they have to be auditable. The euro has taken the lead as the currency of choice for green bond issuance, and that can help catalyze further development of euro area capital markets, provided the right regulatory conditions are put in place. Third, we aim to disseminate our analysis and enrich the wider policy debate and spread awareness of the potential impact of climate change, including through our involvement in the NGFS, the Network for Greening of Financial System, and the ECB is committed to contributing to the Climate Training Alliance, which aims to enhance the training resources that are made available to national financial authorities. Now, moving to the third category, and that's to me the most important one, because we just have to do it. So building on this analysis, the ECB will act within its mandate, will act to contribute to mitigating and averting climate change using the tools, the avenues, and the competence that it has. The Eurosystem has already laid the foundations in several areas. It has agreed on a common stance for applying sustainable and responsible investment principles for some non-monetary policy portfolios, and that applies to all national central banks that are part of the Eurosystem. And since January, we have been accepting in our bond purchases program sustainability-linked bonds as collateral, which used not to be the case because we always only accepted those that had guaranteed and linear coupon. This is no longer the case. And hopefully that will be an encouraging sign. Now, following the conclusion of our strategy review, which has kept us busy for 12 effective working months and 6 months put aside because of COVID, the Governing Council has actually committed to further including climate considerations into our policy operations. Not the framework. Framework we've talked about, but the operations. So let me mention just a few examples. We will develop new experimental indicators covering relevant green financial instruments and the carbon footprint of financial institutions, as well as their exposure to climate-related physical risks. 2, we will introduce disclosure requirements for private sector assets as a new eligibility criterion or as a basis for differentiated treatment for collateral and asset purchases. So it's disclosure and it's assessment of the value as well, or combination of both. 3, we will start conducting climate stress tests of the Eurosystem balance sheet in 2022 to assess the Eurosystem's risk exposure to climate change, leveraging on the methodology of the ECB's economy-wide climate stress test. 4, we will also consider relevant climate change risks when reviewing the valuation and risk control frameworks for assets that are mobilized as collateral by counterparties for Eurosystem credit operations. And we will adjust the framework guiding the allocation of corporate bond purchases to incorporate climate change criteria in line with our mandate. So we're not pushing the boundaries of our mandate. This is not mission creep either. It is within our mandate with the objective of price stability, with the framework and the operations as we have them. We include climate change as part and parcel of our strategy and how we will implement it. Is it going to happen overnight? No, because obviously we are working in close cooperation with the Commission and we expect a lot from the Commission. But I know my colleague and friend, Mr. Gentiloni, is going to speak to those items. So the ECB has committed itself to take those measures and will itself actually reduce its own carbon footprint in line with the requirements of the Paris Agreement. And the ECB banking supervision will ensure that every bank is making swift progress in embedding climate risks into their organizational drawing on the full supervisory toolkit at our disposal when necessary. So I will not prolong this talk, but I want to bounce back from somebody that you, Larry, mentioned, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And he's also the one who said, when launching Apollo and commenting on this unbelievable adventure of going to the moon, he said, you know, we're not going to the moon because it's easy. We are going to the moon because it is hard. Well, I think we are not tackling climate change because it is easy, because it will be hard. We're doing it because we have to do it, and it will be hard, but we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you said many things, and all this is food for thought, but one thing that you said remained to me immediately: the short-term cost pales vis-à-vis the cost of not doing anything. This applies to climate change as it applied this morning or during our meetings when we discussed the preemptive needs of acting on pandemics, future pandemics. I mean, the amazing thing is that in this time we learn to work together. And so, I mean, let's capitalize on that. Thank you very much. But you also mentioned that you expect very much from the European Commission. And so let's see whether the European Commission can respond to these requests.
Of course. No, thank you very much. And again, my gratitude to the Italian presidency. We even went to a theater yesterday evening, which was quite moving. First time since long time. And of course, for all the rest. You know that this, what we call the European Green Deal, this commitment on the carbon neutrality in 2050 has been, since the beginning, the identity card of the new European Commission. Before the pandemic, and strongly so. We defined it since the beginning as our new growth strategy. Then the pandemic came, and indeed we could have put on hold this, saying, well, major problems, and it's difficult to have these two challenges together. As you know, we are trying, and we tried already, with decision already taken, to do the opposite, and so to increase our ambition during the pandemic. I will not bother you with the next generation EU, because I hope that you know everything about, but only remembering the fact that of this unprecedented common debt, we are having, now that we have analyzed quite the huge majority of the plans, we have 39% of these plans dedicated to measures and investment climate-related. You know that we have 30% of this fund in green bonds, of course, with all the discussion on what is the standard of green bonds. And we have every single measure and investment, and I assure you that we have thousands of measures and investments analyzed through what we call the do no significant harm principle. This means that you have 39% of the investment that is climate-related, but nothing, at least in theory, if our analysis was effective, that is against the climate transition. So the idea is that we are not looking only for a rebound in our economies, but we are hoping to use this rebound to change it and to have a more sustainable growth. Now, you know that we also decided, and it is a climate law approved already by the co-legislators, to increase the ambition of the reduction of the emissions from 40% to 55% by 2030. And this is the target of the package that the Commission will approve on Wednesday. I think it is the largest legislative package that the European Commission have ever delivered. So, of course, I will not enter in all these things, but just to remember you a few. First, we will extend our emission trade system, which is there since 2005 and is our carbon pricing system, and it will be extended. Second, we will review a lot of directive, energy taxation, renewables, energy efficiency. Third, we will introduce new emission standards for cars, for example. Fourth, we will have measures to incentivize alternative fuels for transport. And fifth, just to mention the main measures, we will adopt a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Because, of course, the increase of this ambition also increases the risk of carbon leakage. And if we have European companies leaving the EU because of these higher standards, or if we encourage foreign companies that have lower standards in their countries to enlarge their role in the European market, the result will not be a good one for the climate balance. Quite the opposite. So we need this, and of course we need that this mechanism is not a problem with the WTO rules, so we will use what we have, the emission trade system, and mirror it towards our toward imports, and establishing the same price for production, domestic production, and imported production on the basis of their carbon content. Of course, technically not easy, but I think that this experience that will be very gradual in its phasing in and phasing out of other measures will be useful at a global level. All this package, I have to be honest with you, is a difficult package to be fair and just. Because, yes, don't expect unanimity in our societies on these packages, because it's not the case. It could be the case when you say climate neutrality by 2050, but then if you speak about heating of houses, about prices of transport, well, the balance between what we decide and what we give back with social compensation, with just transition schemes, as we call them, is so important. You may remember Chrystia Freeland explaining their experience where they have a very ambitious level of carbon pricing, but also a form of restitution of revenues. It's not revenues for the government. This is a climate measure. So the EU package will be mixed from this point of view. It's not exactly the Canadian model, but the need to be fair and just is there. From this point of view, of course, all this strategy is important to give clarity to investors and to this enormous shift that Larry Fink was mentioning in the appetite of investors. Because this appetite is there, but it needs strategy and clarity. And this is what we can try to do at European level. It doesn't solve all the problem, of course, but I think is important. I completely support what Christine said, and I think that the bank review is extraordinary from this point of view and others. And at the end of the day, keeping our autonomy, of course, the Commission and the bank will work together. This is also something new that happened because of the pandemic, this interplay between monetary and fiscal in fiscal policy. So we support progress towards the global sustainability reporting standards. We have our proposal on corporate sustainability reporting, trying to answer both to the demand of information on impact of climate risks for companies, but also on impact of companies themselves on the environment, because we need reporting on these two streams. And finally, we introduced the EU taxonomy for green investment. We are proud to have this green list, but of course we are aware of the fact that we need a global, so to say, green list. And this is my final word. All the things we are mentioning, carbon pricing, taxonomies, reporting, I think they need a balance between ambition and cooperation. And this is my message. Of course, we need to rethink our institution, and we can do this now because of the pandemic and because of the green challenge. it's now or never from a certain point of view. You can count on the European Union because we proudly will continue to be ambitious, but we are aware of the fact that we need graduality and global coordination, because without this, we will go nowhere. So we can't stop our ambition, this is my opinion, but we have to make it gradual and working together to have a real global cooperation, because of course, only together we will save the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Obviously, the do not significant harm principle is easy to say. It's very hard to follow in the sense that, as you mentioned, there will be consequences, and we have to think how to compensate for these consequences. The Canadians have done it. It is more difficult in an area which has so many stakeholders and country stakeholders, but obviously we cannot refrain from that. You also mentioned the reporting, the taxonomy, all issues that I'm sure Linda-Eling Lee, who is the global head of exactly the ESG research at MSCI, will take. Please, Linda.
Well, I'm really honored to join you today to discuss the role of capital in the net zero economy. I'm going to begin with a question. What will be the largest companies in the world in 2050, so 30 years from now? Well, obviously, we don't know that. What we do know is that today, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Taiwan Semiconductor, these are among the largest public companies in the world. These are the giants that we know from the digital revolution that has really changed all of our lives in the last 30 years. But we should really recall that of the 10 largest companies today, 7 of them didn't actually even exist 30 years ago. So we meet here today at the dawn of another revolution. We think that investors are asking, which companies will thrive or are going to die in the next 30 years. So as we drive emissions to zero, assets are going to be repriced and industries will be unrecognizable. And so this is the net zero revolution. With more than $14.5 trillion that are benchmarked to MSCI's indexes, plus our market leadership in ESG data, ESG ratings, and analytics, we are asked by investors every day how to navigate a low carbon economy. Equally, we're asked by thousands of companies why investors are evaluating their climate strategies. So I'd like to share 3 things with you today that we see at the nexus between companies and investors. First is that what investors are holding in their portfolios today isn't going to work for 2050. There are over 9,000 companies in 50 countries in MSCI's broadest market index. This represents the global equity universe. Now, these companies are putting carbon into the atmosphere at a rate that takes the world to more than 3 degrees warmer by the end of the century. By our calculation, over 90% of all public companies today are not on track to reduce their emissions for keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees. Now, how can an investor actually reduce their carbon intensity of their portfolio if the companies in those portfolios aren't actually doing so? Investors really have 2 choices: influence or reallocate. So as share owners, investors must influence and put pressure on company boards and management to transform their business models. Investors, however, they do need every company on average to reduce carbon intensity by about 10% every year until 2050, just to keep us under 1.5 degrees. That's not going to be easy because we have found, of course, that historically fewer than 1 in 4 companies has actually managed to reduce their emissions by quite this much. This is just a lot to ask. Or investors can reallocate. Investors can move more of their capital to the decarbonizing companies and away from those that are moving too slowly or maybe not even acting at all. But here too, there's a hard limit. Remember, 90% of companies are running too hot, right? Meaning that their emissions trajectory would actually take us beyond a 1.5 to 2 degree rise in temperature. Now, these too hot companies, they're really no longer investable options for a growing number of institutional investors. But these institutional investors have very large pools of capital, and they can't just invest in a smaller and smaller set of companies. So what the world actually really needs are new companies. They need new businesses to invest in. We really need the tech companies of the future, really the innovators of the net zero revolution. Second, the net zero revolution is going to produce not just losers that are holding carbon-stranded assets, but some spectacular winners. So a moment ago, I told you some of the largest companies in the world today. In 1995, at the dawn of the internet, the largest companies included General Electric, ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Petroleum, Philip Morris. Not one was a technology company. Back then, the market value of the tech sector was about 6% of the global equity universe. Today, it's roughly about 20%. Now, at the dawn of the net zero revolution, we're estimating that fewer than 3% of the companies in the MSCI index actually earn a majority of their revenues from clean energy or low carbon technologies. So this revolution begins with these companies helping to transform how we produce and how we consume energy. But in time, this revolution won't just be about displacing traditional fossil fuel companies with renewable energy businesses. It's going to be much bigger than that. Just as the digital revolution has reached far beyond the tech sector to really reach every part of our economy, the net zero revolution is not limited to the energy sector. It's going to touch every company in the world sooner than they imagine. Experience has shown us, though, that identifying the winners of the future is not very straightforward. For every Amazon, dozens, if not hundreds of e-commerce companies have fallen by the wayside. And we tend to forget all the social media sites that died off in the wake of Facebook. This push that we have now for sustainability will likewise see its share of failures. Green startups, which remember are still startups, many companies that are competing to invent low carbon solutions are not going to succeed. Yet some, including ones that may not even exist today, could actually emerge as the titans of a net zero world. So third, how can investors then investigate this future that we've been talking about from the present? Well, in part, they're using indexes. So think of a basket of companies. An index measures the performance of that basket. So if the basket actually has every company in the world in it, then you can weigh the emissions of the world's companies. And then when we embed forward-looking climate metrics, you can get a temperature reading, which tells you that the world's companies would take us to over 3 degrees warmer. Now, I'd like you to imagine that you're at the supermarket. You can choose which companies to actually put into your shopping basket. Next to the prices, you see emissions, or you see a conversion of emissions to a temperature. You can see how every company you put into your shopping basket actually adds to the basket's emissions and changes the basket's temperature. Over the next 3 decades, if the companies of the world actually succeed in decarbonizing, an index like MSCI's index that measures the basket that contains all of the world's public companies, so really the whole supermarket, if you will, the MSCI All-Country World will become a low-carbon index, one that indicates a lower and lower temperature. But we're not there yet, right? So between now and then, investors are using different indexes that integrate their climate concerns. They're creating alternative shopping baskets of what they consider to be healthier choices to take their investments on a faster glide path towards that convergence. So then what do investors actually need to take them into this revolution? Our current market infrastructure has evolved to facilitate capital flows that support a carbon-intensive economy. What we really need is a market infrastructure that's oriented differently, one that actually supports sustainability. A critical component are new types of measurements that show how vulnerable or how resilient every asset is to climate change. These are measurements that can be used as a common language among market participants so that we can value the emerging risks and opportunities in the new economy. These new types of measurements, they require data that we don't have today. And as we look forward to what COP26 could achieve, we urge policymakers and financial regulators of the G20 and the rest of the world to introduce mandatory climate-related disclosures and agree on international standards of disclosure. But we caution regulators and standard setters not to confuse what should be disclosed by companies with what can and should be measured by analysts, by investors, and regulators. So instead of asking companies to each report on their own assessment of climate risk, which will inevitably produce a lot of inconsistent data, ask them for the basic ingredients which they can all disclose immediately. Right now, we lack data on companies' full emissions throughout their entire value chain. And we critically lack disclosures on where their operations are located. These are actually the absolute minimum inputs into any climate risk analysis. So in other words, ask companies for the inputs, and the market will converge on the most decision-useful outputs. And this is how we will collectively construct the pipes for a new market infrastructure. So MSCI will play its part. I'm very pleased today to announce that MSCI will join with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero as part of the Race to Zero campaign to spearhead a Net Zero Financial Service Providers Alliance. This new alliance will galvanize the world's index and data providers, credit rating agencies, and accounting firms to really lay the tracks that can take investors and companies to a net zero world. It would be great if when we look back on 2021, decades from now, we can actually say that this is the moment when the world leaned into its low carbon future, when we entered an era of enterprise and collaboration to make the net zero revolution a reality. Thank you.
So there is a lot of action going on, not only on the part of the asset managers, the central banks, the political community, but also on the part of those who provide services to all those who have to invest and then produce. Thank you very much, Linda. Linda-Eling, I think. I don't know whether your name is both or only the first one.
You can call me Linda, but it's Linda-Eling. Yes, it's my first name.
Okay, thank you. Now we have two pre-recorded messages. There will be short messages, but I think they are worthwhile listening to and seeing them. The first is from Shemara Wikramanayake, who is the Managing Director and CEO of Macquarie. Please.
It's a pleasure to be joining you today from Sydney. We gather more certain than ever that we are in the decisive decade in our drive towards net zero, and that this is the pivotal year in that decade as we work to deliver inclusive growth and a just transition. While our progress and momentum give us grounds for optimism, we also need to be clear-eyed on the challenges. Our optimism comes from the progress we see in developed countries where solutions are being deployed at ever-increasing scale. With continued commitment, a pathway to net zero is in sight for many countries. This progress reflects successful partnerships between the public and the private sectors, where governments have set clear direction and investment frameworks, businesses have developed technology, projects, and delivery capability. We in the finance community have worked on innovative ways to fuel the transition with private capital, helping to deliver it at speed and scale. One of our greatest challenges is how we now replicate that success in emerging markets, a defining issue for all countries at COP26. It is in emerging markets where demand for energy is rising most, up 70% in the past decade versus flat demand in Europe and the US. And yet in these markets, it's where investment has remained stubbornly low. For every dollar invested in energy transition in emerging markets, we've seen $20 invested in developed markets. And while these modest levels of investment have been concentrated in renewables, investment in climate resilience is further behind, despite an increasingly urgent need. Low levels of investment, however, do not signal a lack of ambition. Governments from more than 80 emerging markets have declared their intent to set a net zero target, and they're aware of the need to work on policy frameworks that will attract capital. But at the same time, we need to recognise that much of that capital will belong to pensioners and insurance holders who need appropriate risk-adjusted returns while also delivering sound community outcomes. We've seen these dynamics play out in Macquarie's long-standing involvement in infrastructure investment globally. The challenges are the same for infrastructure focused on emissions reduction. Progress has been weighted towards a small number of markets, their success rooted in strong enabling environments for clean energy investment, attracting private capital. This remains the exception. Put simply, emerging markets face a significant finance gap that is holding back their ambitions and their transitions. And that's why I'm pleased to support two important initiatives, both designed to help mobilise greater volumes of private capital to accelerate the transition of emerging markets. Earlier this year at President Biden's summit, Mark Carney, with the UN Climate Actions Champions, launched the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, bringing together financial firms from across the world to work together to support the transition to net zero. And alongside important GFAN's work in areas such as transition pathways for hard-to-abate sectors, I'm proud on behalf of Macquarie to lead the GFAN's work stream to accelerate capital mobilisation for climate solutions in emerging markets. We'll be seeking broad input now on our priorities, but I expect them to include actions in the four following areas. Firstly, working with governments on their specific challenges to help create tailored enabling environments to attract that capital. Secondly, strengthening collaboration between private capital and multilateral development banks and development finance institutions to deliver financing solutions. Thirdly, scaling up the great work of existing catalytic initiatives such as the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative, which I'll talk about, Fast Infra, and the UN's Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance. And ultimately accelerating the flow of private climate finance into emerging markets, connecting willing capital to a growing pipeline of investable projects. Now, one of the initiatives that GFAN's members will be looking to harness is, as I mentioned, the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative. CFLI is a group of 7 leading institutions from across the investment value chain. And this initiative, convened by Michael Bloomberg, has been working for some time to mobilise private climate finance in emerging markets. And in the next phase, we're focused on driving practical outcomes in some key countries. These two complementary initiatives will, I hope, help strengthen the engagement of private investors in the multifaceted challenge of emerging markets and build on the important work of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. I believe that the finance community can play an important role alongside governments and other corporates in the vital transition of emerging markets, and we are ready to play our part. Thank you.
Very good. So now we go to the President of COP26, Minister of the UK government, Alok Sharma. Let's see.
Good afternoon, and thank you to Minister Franco and Governor Visco for organising this conference. Friends, climate change is the greatest challenge that we face, and we must act now to protect people and nature from its impacts and drive down global emissions. In 2015, the countries of the world signed the Paris Agreement and committed to do all they could to limit global temperature rises to well below 2 degrees and closer to 1.5 degrees. Now, to keep that 1.5 degree limit within reach, we must halve global emissions by 2030. And these efforts depend on finance. Without it, the task ahead is near impossible. So one of my key aims for COP26 is to get finance flowing to climate action, both public finance and private finance. And we must all respond with the urgency the crisis demands, particularly to mobilize public and private finance into emerging markets and developing countries where the need is greatest, and help to build green economies, creating jobs and prosperity. On climate, the G20 nations must lead. And of course, I welcome the progress made by finance ministers and central bank governors over the last 2 days, and I am encouraged by the work of the Sustainable Finance Framework and Infrastructure Working Groups and the Financial Stability Board. Now, when it comes to public finance, it is essential that developed countries deliver the $100 billion a year that they have promised to developing countries. In 2018, we mobilized $80 billion, a significant amount, but not enough. And as I've always said, delivering the full $100 billion is a matter of trust. So I welcome the fact that under the UK presidency, every G7 country has committed to increase its public finance commitments, including finance for adaptation. Canada, Germany and Japan have put new money on the table immediately after the G7 summit. And I look forward to other donors, including other G7 countries, stepping up with new or increased commitments ahead of COP26. And I'm pleased that the IMF is preparing a $650 billion allocation of special drawing rights. The G7 has made clear that they want to channel almost a sixth of the newly allocated SDRs to support healthy, green and resilient recoveries from COVID-19 in the poorest and most vulnerable countries. And I very much support this call and want other countries to back the G7's approach. And I want to see a much, much more ambitious level of SDR recycling from the richer nations than we saw immediately after the 2009 financial crisis. So I urge richer countries and the IMF to respond urgently to the G7's call on SDRs and the G20 to address the debt challenges faced by developing countries. I also urge multilateral development banks to take action. Every MDB should set a date by which they will align with the Paris Agreement, as the World Bank and the EBRD have done. And every MDB should meet their climate finance targets, increasing them where possible, and develop plans to mobilize more private finance. And when it comes to private finance, we're of course working closely with finance ministers in coordination with the efforts of Mark Carney to ensure that every financial decision takes climate into account. And members of GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, today represents over $88 trillion of assets, all signed up to science-based targets to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050 at the latest. This is good news, yet we know barriers exist to investment in emerging markets. Many can seem too risky to attract large-scale institutional capital, and investors are cautious. Yet we know that emerging markets hold enormous investment opportunities. The IFC estimates that there are nearly $23 trillion in opportunities for climate-smart investments in emerging markets between now and 2030. So, as Shemara has just said, we must bring public and private finance together to break down the barriers to investment and to support a just and inclusive transition to global net zero. And I welcome Macquarie leading the GFAN's work to accelerate this capital into emerging markets. And I welcome today's discussion on how MDBs can support the transition to global net zero. I urge MDBs and private financial firms to increase their collaboration and scale up blended finance initiatives and technical assistance, and to improve the conditions for investment within countries and build pipelines of high-quality bankable projects. Together, you can demonstrate that public finance can de-risk investment and leverage insignificant private capital. So ahead of COP, I encourage MDBs to share plans for mobilizing private finance faster, and I urge private financial institutions to work with MDBs on these plans to help show how finance will flow in support of countries' ambitious plans for climate action. Such steps are essential if we're to redirect the sums flowing through the global economy towards our green future and secure the trillions of dollars required to build resilience, meet global net zero, and keep the 1.5 degree limit alive. These collaborative efforts must endure far beyond COP26. Friends, this is the decisive decade, and the decisions you take now will set the course of the planet. Business as usual is not an option. So let's work together to divert finance from the polluting industries of the past towards our clean, green, and resilient future, creating jobs and growth in every corner of the globe. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you can take your seats, we are starting with the next session. We will have two presentations, and the first will be by Randal Quarles, who's the chair of the Financial Stability Board, and of course the vice chair of the Federal Reserve. And he'll talk about the work by the FSB to promote common understanding and harmonized disclosure, common understanding on data, harmonized disclosure, to help actors in the financial markets to measure climate risk and manage them. And the second presentation by Mark Carney will focus on what private financial institutions are doing, what they could do in the future to mobilize the resources needed for the net zero transition. Mark Carney, as I think everybody in the room knows, had a long career both in the private and public sector. And although there are many experienced central bankers here and that have been in Venice, I think he has the rare distinction of having been the governor of two separate national central banks, besides, of course, being Randy's predecessors at the FSB and Mario Draghi's successor at the FSB. But now he is speaking, I think, in his capacity of as the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, and the UK's Prime Minister Finance Advisor for COP26. So, Randy, you can take the floor first, and then Mark will follow with his remarks. Please go.
Terrific. Thank you. Thanks, Federico. It's a pleasure to be here. After a year of remote conversations, it really is wonderful to see you all in person. As chair of the Financial Stability Board, I have the privilege of collaborating with the Italian G20 presidency, with the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors, and with the FSB membership on the most pressing issues affecting financial stability. And among those issues, one of increasing focus is understanding and monitoring climate-related financial risks. And given the global nature of climate change, this demands a coordinated international effort. So the FSB published last Wednesday a climate roadmap that presents a comprehensive and coordinated plan to address climate-related financial risks. The FSB's roadmap dovetails with the ongoing work of the G20's Sustainable Finance Working Group, or SFWG, to develop a broader sustainable finance roadmap. So today, in my role as chair of the FSB, I'd like to focus on two foundational components of the FSB's roadmap: disclosures and data. Globally consistent, comparable, and reliable disclosures, as well as a broader set of high-quality relevant data together, can provide the basis to assess climate-related financial risks and the impact on financial stability. The FSB was an early leader in bringing attention to the importance of reliable entity-level disclosures to assess and manage climate-related financial risks and opportunities. In 2015, under Mark Carney's leadership, the FSB submitted a proposal to the G20 to create an industry-led disclosure task force on climate-related risks. The work of this FSB-sponsored Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, has led to greater recognition of the importance of climate-related financial risk and of comparable and reliable disclosures. The early development of industry-led recommendations and a usable framework by users and producers of this information was critical. And the four core elements of TCFD recommendations have provided a widely accepted framework for disclosures, covering governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. The task force has continued to provide significant support to those seeking to disclose and has encouraged steadily increasing uptake. These initial steps greatly help to define appropriate parameters, drive towards consistency, and give the public sector a running start in developing their own approaches. Now is the time to build on that work. It will be useful to establish a globally consistent baseline standard for climate-related disclosures. Globally consistent and comparable entity-level disclosures by non-financial companies, by banks, by insurers, and by asset managers are increasingly important to market participants and financial authorities as a means of providing information needed to assess and manage risks. The G20 presidency, in developing its 2021 work program, asked the FSB to encourage more consistency in disclosure practices. As a start, the FSB surveyed what financial authorities across our membership were doing to promote disclosures. Almost all of our members have already set requirements, guidance, or expectations, or plan to do so. We found some heterogeneity in the approaches they were taking. Some members prefer mandated disclosure, others would make it voluntary. There's variation in the desired scope of disclosures, but there is a trend towards an important baseline that focuses on one-way materiality, that is, the financial risk that climate change could have on a particular entity, based on the TCFD recommendations. The majority of our membership are already using the TCFD recommendations as a baseline for their own requirements or guidance. The International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, or IFRS, in consultation with other international organizations, will develop now a set of standards, starting initially with climate, and building upon these TCFD recommendations. As reflected in our statement of December 2020, the FSB supports IFRS's advancement of an International Sustainability Standards Board to take this work quickly forward. This work holds the promise of providing baseline standards that could inform or be built upon by national authorities as they develop their approaches to climate-related financial disclosure or to broader sustainability disclosure. The initial focus of the IFRS will be on climate standards, while allowing for interoperability with individual jurisdictions' frameworks that may go beyond climate-related impacts. But consistency in one-way disclosures would provide a needed avenue for accurate and appropriate risk assessment and comparability to assess investment decisions. Simultaneously, the IFRS standards are intended to provide flexibility for national authorities to build on the baseline. The interoperability feature will allow jurisdictions to address broader or jurisdiction-specific concerns in a manner consistent with their legal and regulatory frameworks, and indeed to go further in scope or faster if they wish. Given the importance of this work, we encourage the IFRS to press forward as quickly as possible. In the interim, the FSB encourages jurisdictions that are implementing frameworks to base them on the TCFD recommendations to avoid unnecessary fragmentation. The need for high-quality, reliable data doesn't stop at firms' disclosures, however. International initiatives are needed to improve data quality and to address data gaps, and ultimately to establish a basis of comprehensive, consistent, and comparable data for global monitoring and for assessing climate-related financial risks. We published a separate report on this topic last week. Our data needs include data on the underlying drivers of physical and transition risk, and on financial institutions' exposures. The challenges here are considerable. To understand the financial risks, better information is needed on the underlying physical risks, including the sorts of extreme weather events that pose greatest risks to the balance sheets of households, firms, and financial institutions. Comparable data is also needed on the nature of jurisdictions' climate change targets and on their progress in meeting them. All this information needs to be related to financial risks, including financial institutions' exposures to non-financial counterparties. As has been said earlier today, this is not an easy task. The current lack of usable data is a reflection of difficulties in transforming existing information on the drivers of climate risk into reliable metrics that quantify financial risks. The key here is to find metrics that are forward-looking, recognizing that the nature and magnitude of future climate-related risks may differ from those in the past. Improved financial risk data can also help achieve the financial stability mandates of financial authorities. For example, the FSB is exploring how to assess the degree to which climate-related risks might be transferred or amplified by different financial sectors. For example, the interdependence of banks and insurance firms. Climate-related risks vary across jurisdictions. We need to look at how risks might be amplified by feedback loops with the real economy. Such analysis will contribute to a more comprehensive and global understanding of how to assess climate change and potential effects on the financial system, but those efforts are hampered by a variety of data limitations. The FSB is working with international bodies, such as the International Monetary Fund, other international groupings, such as the Network for Greening the Financial System, to assess climate data gaps and to identify steps to address them, with a special emphasis on ensuring cross-sectoral and international consistency. For example, the FSB plans to coordinate work with the NGFS on the issues surrounding scenario analyses, which some jurisdictions are using or contemplating, and the financial metrics that would be useful for such an analysis, both at the level of the firm and the overall system. Examining scenario analysis presents many challenges: a very long time horizon, which requires dynamic balance sheet analysis, and the need to capture the interplay between the macroeconomy and the drivers of climate-related risks are two such challenges that need to be overcome. So today, the FSB is well positioned to lead the next phases of the work required to address and assess climate-related financial risk. The FSB's mandate, its diverse membership, and its connection to the G20 make it the ideal forum to forge a consensus on the appropriate path forward. The FSB, as laid out in our roadmap, has taken on a critical role in coordinating and carrying forward work that will make the global financial system more resilient to the threats posed by climate change. The roadmap establishes a strategic vision for addressing climate-related financial risks, which sets out how we'll coordinate with other standard-setting bodies and international organizations in order to make progress towards our goal. The climate roadmap leverages the FSB's strength as a coordinating body, provides some structure to the vast amount of work on climate-related financial risk that's currently going on internationally, and clarifies interdependencies between various work streams and between issues. The climate roadmap sets the course and promotes consistency through, among other things, building consensus around common principles, best practices, and cross-jurisdictional alignment. These include the two broad objectives I've focused on today: establishing consistent, comparable, and reliable information through a global baseline standard for disclosures, and through improving the availability and quality of data. The roadmap also includes work on analytical tools and on policy approaches developed for identifying and managing climate-related financial risks. We have a long road ahead of us, but every journey begins with the first steps, and the FSB will continue to coordinate and contribute to understanding and addressing the challenges of the financial system that arise from these risks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Randy. It's very impressive, and I'm going to touch on the FSB roadmap. I'll just underscore at the start how important and significant it is. I would like to thank you, Governor Visco and Minister Franco, for bringing us to Venice, for the inspiration and the progress, but fundamentally for the Italian presidency's drive to build a more sustainable global financial system, a drive that extends to your leadership in COP26 alongside the UK. I went back, like many, I went back to the history of Venice, refreshed on the history of Venice, and I realized that the first inhabitants here were seeking shelter in the marshlands from waves of invasions, invading hordes, if you will, as the Roman Empire was going through a little difficult period. But from those humble beginnings, obviously they built the foundations of a great commercial power that would conquer the world through trade. The analogy is that Venice, indeed the whole world, is again under siege from rising sea levels, from extreme weather, from climate change. And these waves won't stop unless we build the right foundations and then look outwards to transform our world. And that's what the Italian presidency is doing through the G20, helping to lay the foundations of a financial system in which every decision takes climate change into account. And Randy has just stressed the core elements of that. I want to hit those quickly and then look outward and reinforce just the importance of climate financial reporting because what's measured gets managed. It was only 5.5 years ago that TCFD was a concept at Paris. Just 3 years ago, the recommendations were delivered to G20 leaders in Hamburg. Today, virtually the entire private financial sector wants this disclosure. Over 2,000 major companies across the G20 are responding. But as you've heard, despite these advances, coverage is still limited and disclosure itself or reporting itself is incomplete, particularly of those critical forward-looking metrics. The private sector has taken this about as far as it can, and now is the time for the G20 to finish the job and make TCFD disclosure mandatory. Very much welcome the FSB's roadmap that was released last Wednesday and the support of the G20 for it, the importance of disclosure at its heart, and also very much welcome and salute you, Erkki Leikinen, for the IFRS's foundation's intention to establish a new international sustainability standards board to produce a climate disclosure standard based on the TCFD by the middle of next year. I think this is something I'd underscore, and clearly building on the progress that's been made elsewhere. Now, better disclosure, it's not perfect, and we do need better disclosure and more data, but that and a heightened sense of urgency is leading to a transformation in climate risk management. This began with central banks and supervisors at the NGFS. Just a few years ago, there were 8 founding members. There are now over 90 authorities in countries representing 80% of global emissions and all of the world's globally systemic financial institutions. Central banks in countries with more than 50% of global emissions are beginning to conduct climate stress tests. And I would like to salute the BIS, the NGFS, the IAIS, and the Sustainable Insurance Forum who have banded together and today are launching the Climate Training Alliance, which is a way of building financial risk capacity more broadly. Now, for COP26, our priorities with respect to the foundations of the system are to secure mandatory disclosure, climate disclosure, to embed supervisory expectations for more effective climate risk management, to mainstream the use of those NGFS scenarios, not just for stress tests, but more broadly their use within the financial sector so they can be used and improved, and to ramp up climate stress testing. So those are the foundations, and now I want to look outward and focus on 3 elements, commitments, alignment, and engagement. Commitments obviously begin with the net zero commitments of countries. These have risen from 30%, covering 30% of global emissions when Italy and the UK assumed the presidency of COP. It's now over 70%. And those country-level commitments are cascading down to the levels of companies, company net zero commitments, and we are building commitment within the financial sector for a whole economy transition, because I think as this room fully appreciates, we will not get to net zero in a niche. Rather, it's virtually every company in every sector that needs to transform, as Linda-Eling was saying in the previous session, and this will require enormous investment, up to $100 trillion over the next 3 decades. Now, you've heard a bit about the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ. It was created to help meet those needs. It currently brings together over 250 financial institutions responsible for well over $80 trillion of assets. It's anchored in the COP's Race to Zero. It's the gold standard for financial sector commitments to sustainability. By joining GFANZ, financial institutions commit to manage their investments or their lending or insurance underwriting as appropriate to net zero by 2050, but they also set interim targets across Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, including 5-year decarbonization plans and sectoral targets. They embed board accountability, and they will report their progress annually. We will deepen and broaden GFAN's membership in the run-up to COP. We've added over 10 trillion in assets in just 2 months since it was launched at the Biden summit. Major insurers and reinsurers are working on an alliance to align their underwriting with net zero, as you'll hear more from Generali's CEO Philippe Donnet shortly, I think in the next panel. And also, as you've heard from Linda-Eling, we're forming an alliance of market infrastructure providers, including index providers, credit rating agencies, stock exchanges, who will align their products. This is the critical thing. They're aligning their products and services with the financing of net zero. By Glasgow, in November, all major financial firms, including private equity firms and sovereign wealth funds, should decide whether they too will be part of the solution to climate change or risk facilitating the type of climate arbitrage to which Larry Fink referred in the earlier panel. I'm also pleased that Larry is joining Jane Fraser of Citi and Oliver Bott of Allianz in leading another GFAN's working group, which is looking to address net zero transition plans, including issues around how to defease stranded assets. So GFAN's, it's a big tent. It's also the only tent that will be available at Glasgow. There are many well-intentioned initiatives, but now, as we've learned over the course of today, or been reminded, I think this group been reminded over the course of today, now is not the time for half measures. So GFAN starts with commitments, but its real purpose is climate action through alignment and engagement. Alignment means defining best practices for net zero plans for companies and financial institutions. And to these ends, it will leverage existing work on net zero plans by member alliances and initiatives such as PCAF, or the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Framework. It will build on existing sector and country-specific science-based pathways from organizations like the Transition Pathway Initiative and Science Based Target Initiative. Alignment also means robust assessments of the portfolios of financial institutions relative to net zero pathways. GFAN's members, as I said a moment ago, are focused on whole economy transition. It requires much more than the financing of deep green activities or blacklisting of dark brown ones. We need 50 shades of green to catalyze and support all companies that are committed to moving to net zero. And in this regard, I'd like to commend the central banks, notably the ECB and the Bank of England, who are helping to set the tone and develop some of the technologies in order to do this as they look at revising, as appropriate, their collateral frameworks or monetary policy operations consistent with their legislated responsibilities in their jurisdictions. Now, more broadly, the options range from setting targets for emissions to eligibility assessments that are based on whether companies have net zero transition plans, to tilting portfolios to issuers that perform strongly on climate change metrics based on scorecards of past efforts to decarbonize, current emissions intensity, and forward-looking metrics. And in the private sector, there is work that has been done, again, coordinated through the TCFD, that has looked at, has conducted an extensive review of methodologies to assess portfolio alignment techniques, including benchmark, divergence, and implied temperature rise assessments that Linda-Eling referred to earlier. And what's happening is we're now picking up that work into GFANs to see how it can be applied more broadly across the financial sector. And this will provide an essential complement to more binary taxonomies that serve more specific objectives. Now, the combination of forward-looking climate disclosure, net zero plans, and portfolio alignment will pull forward investments, especially if there are credible and predictable climate policies. So I'm hearkening back to this morning's discussion and the discussion chaired by Gillian. And one of the things she referenced, a paper that Janet Yellen, Philip Hildebrand, and myself participated in for the G30, which made this point, and actually Augustine, who's not here at the moment, that's the analog to central banking. That is, if you have the predictable policies and you have a financial sector that has the information it needs, it will pull forward adjustment. As I would suggest, as a practical example, we're beginning to see in the European automotive sector because of the decisions that Paolo Gentiloni and others have referenced. Okay, this brings me to my final area, which is around engagement. Now, estimates vary, but most suggest that the world will need at least an additional $1.5 to $2 trillion of investment annually for up to 3 decades as we transform our economies. The IEA estimates that 3/4 of this must flow to emerging and developing economies, and about 3/4 of those flows would be privately financed. I think it's safe to say that wherever you fall in that range, we're well off the mark. In recent years, and Shemara referenced this, it's about a 20-to-1 ratio on their numbers in terms of clean energy investment advanced versus emerging economies, and about a 6-to-1 ratio for sustainable debt issuance. So as others have noted, we need to do a few things. First is to turn billions of public capital into trillions of private capital by scaling blended finance as appropriate, catalyzing standalone private capital flows, and building new markets. MDBs, as others have mentioned, are uniquely placed to help with this, to mobilize private finance. I think we should recognize that, as I said a moment ago, that thus far the scale of what we've done, collectively done, is relatively modest. The official figures, which we'll understate, but the official figures suggest in 2018 that private finance in developing economies mobilized by MDBs reached $10.8 billion in 2018, or 14% of total climate finance. So orders of magnitude need to change. We have needs that are measured in the trillions, flows that are measured in the tens of billions at best. And I would suggest that a rule of thumb for climate finance is to concentrate on initiatives that have the prospect of catalyzing at least 50, ideally $100 billion of flows per year of investment flows to emerging and developing economies for decades. Of course, actual investments will depend on specific projects and the overall investment environment within recipient countries, including the credibility of NDCs, but those conditions are more likely to develop if sufficient financing capacity is in place, or at least the prospect is in place. And I'd suggest that in order to help orchestrate a step change in that financing capacity, there are 3 related initiatives. The first comes from the private sector. GFAN's working group, led by Shemara, will build on initiatives including Fast Infra, the GISD, the CFLI, to secure commitments of significant private financing capacity for projects to advance the net zero transitions in emerging and developing economies. And that financing obviously will be both bank and market-based. Secondly, public facilities. The MDBs should be encouraged to identify and be prepared to dramatically scale up blended financial vehicles and facilities that support significant mobilization of private capital. There are some very strong potential candidates, including the IFC's Managed Co-Lending Portfolio Program, the African Development Bank's Room to Run Synthetic Securitization Program, and platforms like the G20's Global Infrastructure Facility. Thirdly, and crucially, country platforms, and we heard a bit about this earlier. The public and private sector are coming together through initiatives such as the GISD and the CFLI to build country platforms which will help address specific needs, such as phasing out coal in some countries or decarbonizing steel and cement in others, as well as broader investment environment challenges such as dispute resolution mechanisms and subsidies. Now, with basic point is that we have the core of the private financial system, 80 trillion plus of balance sheet, that is focused on transition to net zero. So what follows from that is that country platforms need to integrate Paris-aligned NDCs in order to attract that capital at scale. It needs to be consistent with the alignment. But if it is consistent with the alignment, it will be that much more attractive. Projects that are consistent with long-term country strategies that are Paris-aligned are more likely to attract private capital and less likely to be subject, I would suggest, to project risk, including chances of changes in regulation because of the interrelationships there. Now, so as some others have suggested, we need a pretty radical adjustment to our international financing architecture for climate, and I again commend the Italian presidency for putting this on the table. I'm going to finish by referencing one element of that, which is the need to build a high-integrity market for carbon offsets. Now, the conditions for this market are coming into place. There are over 1,600 major companies that have committed to set science-based targets, not just net zero plans, but science-based targets. To achieve them, they need the appropriate mix. In fact, they need to focus first and foremost on absolute emission reductions. But there will be, in some cases, a need to use highly credible, high-integrity carbon offsets because of technological constraints, for example, in the steel and cement sectors. I'd go further. I'd suggest that, and I join Lord Stern and Lord Turner and others in this, I would suggest that to keep the total stock of our carbon emissions below our critical threshold, our aspiration should be that companies not only aim to meet net zero in 2050 as an endpoint, but on top of the absolute decarbonization of their own operations, in line with scientific consensus, companies should also compensate and neutralize residual emissions on the path to net zero. Now, in terms of scale of that market, at present, the market for carbon offsets, it's fragmented. There are a number of challenges with it, inconsistent. It's about $1 billion a year of investment. This market should be 100 to 150 billion a year and can be that by the middle of this decade. And the capital flows are from companies in advanced economies for projects that would be overwhelmingly located in emerging and developing economies, potentially with significant co-benefits for biodiversity, SDGs, and in some cases, the funding of the avoidance of emissions and effectively the funding of defeasance of stranded assets. If you're interested, the private sector task force led by Bill Winters and Annette Nazareth have just completed their work. Over 250 organizations from around the world, a combination of private sector and NGOs, have published their final recommendations for this market. London and Singapore have signaled their interest in hosting this market, and I would strongly recommend, given the need for engagement on this. So let me finish from those troubled beginnings that I referenced at the start. Venice, clearly a city of unimaginable wealth and beauty. Its splendor continues to inspire. Let's build on the inspiration of the last few days, build the foundations that Randy and his colleagues are putting in place for a sustainable financial system, align the flows for the capital investment that we need to advance our objectives for people, planet, and prosperity. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much, Mark and Randy, for your very thoughtful and insightful presentation. I think one leitmotif of both your presentation was the need for cooperation between the private and the public sectors, and I think this dovetails very, very well with the subject of the next panel, the final panel of this conference, whose title is Regulations, Disclosures, Financial Risks, and Private Financing for the Green Economy. So I would like to invite Professor Alessandro Merli of Johns Hopkins University to take his seats on stage together with those panelists that are actually present here, who are Mr. Philippe Donnet, Group CEO of Assicurazioni Generali, Mr. Erkki Liikanen, the Chair of Trustees of the IFRS Foundation, and Ms. Lamia Merzoki, co-chair of the International Network of Financial Centers for Sustainability. They will be joined online by Ms. Fernanda Necchio, of now the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and Mr. Ma Jun of the China Society for Finance and Banking, and representing also the Chinese co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. So, Professor Medley, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. Let me start by thanking the organizers, Minister Franco and Governor Visco, for inviting us to take part in this panel. And I would also like to thank the audience who's still here, in spite of the fact that we're about an hour late, and in spite of the obviously unfair competition from the beauties of Venice on a sunny Sunday afternoon. We'll try and be concise and make up for some lost time. As it's already been mentioned, we'll work on a hybrid scheme like a previous panel. We've already missed the Wimbledon final, but don't worry, we'll release you in time for watching at least the Euro final. Starts at 9, so hopefully I'm not optimistic there. I think we should start by saying that this is an extraordinary meeting of the G20 in the sense that a few years ago these issues may have been relegated to environment ministers, peripheral issues. Now they are front and center on the debate, and they are discussed by finance ministers and central bank governors. Finance and climate change. We try and focus now on the role of the private sector. A lot of things have already been said. The most important is that public finance will not be sufficient to meet the financing needs that are needed to reorient the global economy in a green direction. Augustine Cartens had told us that the money is there, definitely the appetite from investors is there. We've watched the boom in green bonds, ESG funds, and maybe what's new also, it's for the first time, unlike in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, there is a willingness from both regulators and supervisors and banks and other financial institutions to be on the same side, because there is a growing awareness that this is a recognition that it's a common problem, and that climate risk is, as President Lagarde said, is a financial stability risk. It's a financial stability risk for the system and for individual financial institutions. We'll move a bit from the macro to the micro picture. Governor Carney has given a lot of numbers already. Private sector institutions know that they have to set up the right governance, the right strategy. In terms of governance, we've watched what happened at Exxon. More and more companies are including ESG or climate experts in their boards. Strategy, risk management tools to deal with climate risk, and metrics, which is something that we'll talk a little bit about in this panel. Not least, maybe consider peripheral issues, but not least in measuring executive performance and executive compensation. We'll look at some plumbing issues in the markets. This is not a glamorous thing. It's not a pleasant thing sometimes, but anyone in Venice will tell you that it's an essential issue. So a little bit of plumbing, and I'll give immediately the floor to our first panelist, the CEO of Generali, Philippe Donnet, who will start speaking not just on behalf of Generali, but on behalf of a group of some of the biggest insurance companies. I think Governor Carney has already alluded to that, but I'll let Mr. Donnet explain what insurance companies are trying to do, practical steps to address these climate issues. Mr. Donnet.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. And thank you to Mr. Franco and Governor Visco for inviting me to address the G20 finance on behalf of the whole insurance and reinsurance industry. It's a real honor for me to be with you today. We all know that climate change is the biggest challenge we face as a society. We are talking about an emergency that requires not only our full attention, but most importantly, our urgent action. The last decade has been the warmest one ever recorded, and 2019 was the second warmest year on record, with the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere rising new highs. While the measures to contain the global COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent economic downturn may have resulted in a short-term drop in greenhouse gas emissions, obviously it was unfortunately only temporary. No country is immune to climate change. Lives and economies are being affected. Sea levels are rising, and weather-related damage is becoming increasingly more extreme, both in terms of frequency and intensity. In 2015, the adoption of the Paris Agreement aimed to catalyze a global response to the climate threat by limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by the end of this century. This will require a transition of the entire economy, with companies adjusting their business models, developing credible and ambitious plans, and most importantly, implementing them. The insurance and reinsurance sectors can play and have to play an important role in accelerating the transition to a resilient net zero emissions economy in line with the 1.5 degrees target. This is exactly why today, here in Venice, 8 global insurance and reinsurance leaders, together with the United Nations Environment Programme, are making a historic commitment by launching the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. These are Allianz, AXA, Aviva, Munich Re, SCOR, Swiss Re, Zurich, and of course, Generali. And I'm truly honored to both announce and represent here the Alliance as its ambassador in this G20 finance meeting in Venice. Our goal is to transition our insurance and reinsurance underwriting portfolios to net zero emissions by 2050, in line with the 1.5 degree target of the Paris Agreement. Through our core insurance and reinsurance business and guided by climate science, we are determined to make this alliance achieve a greater, longer-lasting impact and contribution to economic, social, and environmental sustainability. The Net Zero Insurance Alliance builds on the climate leadership of institutional investors, such as insurance and reinsurance companies and pension funds, via the United Nations convened Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, whose members have already committed to transition their investment portfolios to net zero emissions by 2050. After all, it is in the nature of the insurance and the reinsurance industry to have a long-term vision and to exercise preventive measures for what might be perceived as huge risks in the future. Also, as both investors and insurers with operations all around the world, we, the founders and future members of this alliance, are in a position to have a positive influence on our many stakeholders. For example, we can engage with our clients and potential clients with significant greenhouse gas intensive activities and help them with their decarbonization strategies and net zero transition pathways. We can develop and offer insurance and reinsurance solutions for low emissions and zero emission technologies and nature-based solutions that can absorb greenhouse gas emissions. And last but not least, we can advocate for government policies for a science-based and socially just transition of economic sectors to net zero. One thing is clear: to successfully tackle climate change, we must work, decide, and act all together. The G20 and the world's governments, the United Nations, the private sector, and society at large. And we need to accelerate, as the climate emergency is a race against time, and it's a race we just cannot afford to lose. We are committed to make the Net Zero Insurance Alliance a truly global one, and we want to involve more insurers and reinsurers, as well as insurance brokers and other insurance market participants in this journey to a resilient net zero emissions economy. In a nutshell, the whole insurance and reinsurance industry is committed to tackle this unprecedented challenge posed by climate change and to build a safer, healthier, more prosperous, more inclusive, and more sustainable future for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Donnet. It's actually hard to overstate the importance of the insurance sector in this area as both insurer and investor. I'll give you now the floor to Erkki Liikanen, who's chairing the IFRS Foundation and is known to many of us also as former governor of the Central Bank of Finland, but he was also a EU commissioner, a minister, and he has a long history with climate change, but with the measures for countering climate change. But in this case, we can say that data is key, disclosure is key. We were told by the FSB chair that investors need a map, a roadmap, and I think disclosure standards will be completely essential. So is there a path for global standards for disclosure on sustainability, and what is the role for governments, and what is the role for the international standard setting bodies?
Thank you very much, Alessandro. I also want to thank host for the invitation, hospitality, and also great content of this event, including the issues papers which came beforehand, which are very good, concise presentations of the issue. Sustainability, including climate reporting, is a very broad discipline, ranging from jurisdiction requirements for companies to report against specific policy objectives, up to investors' need for global comparability of sustainability-related financial disclosures. These all are important, but the focus of IFRS is to meet the information needs of investors. I think that there's a path to global sustainability standards if we can create a global baseline of sustainability-related disclosures to facilitate comparability for investment decision-making, and at the same time work with the jurisdictions to ensure compatibility between this global baseline and their own policy initiatives. Macquarie referred in his recent famous book, Values, to the tragedy of the horizon. He defines 3 pillars for the solution. First is public policies, second, company transition plans, and third, disclosures of climate-related risks and opportunities. I think that's a good division. Governments and jurisdictions are required to establish clear policy frameworks, Investors price investment capital based on how those policies will impact companies in the long term. This in turn provides companies with an incentive to embrace sustainable business models. The efficiency of the supply chain is dependent on high quality, globally comparable information on which investors can assess sustainability risks and make informed decisions. This is the role of investor-focused international standard setters such as IFRS Foundation. It is to enable the achievement of policy objectives by developing standards that bring consistency and transparency for the global capital markets. The separation of roles and responsibilities is made elegantly clear by Gentiloni in his book, who emphasizes that economics is a science of means, not of aims. Common objectives of society largely rely on values, and governments determine the objectives. Economics and the market can in turn provide means to meet the objectives at the lowest possible cost. Similarly, disclosure standards do not set the policy objectives, but they can be a valuable instrument to support the delivery of those policy objectives. When sustainability reporting can be asked to promote broad policy objectives, the responsibility belongs to elected bodies and institutions. But an additional question has been raised whether for a more limited task to provide sustainability-related disclosure for investors, global standards would be needed. This question was often put in front of the IFRS Foundation because its financial reporting standards are required for use by more than 140 countries. Ignazio, Visco and Gentiloni spoke about the years 1997-1999 after Kyoto Protocol, exciting period. Just a little later, in 2000-2001, IFRS Foundation and International Accounting Standards Board was founded by IOSCO's support. Paul Walker was a great player in that game. Interestingly, at that time, financial reporting and climate change did not meet. Of course, USA had pulled out of Kyoto Protocol. Now in 2021, it has all changed. IFRS organized last year a consultation for the strategy review where the focus was on just sustainability reporting. And we started with two questions. The first was, is there demand for global standards? And second, if so, should the IFRS Foundation to play a role in developing such standards? And our conclusion was, even beforehand, that we are ready to serve only if needed, if there's demand. The responses showed a growing and urgent demand for a single set of global sustainability-related disclosure standards. And a great number of commentators also wrote that IFRS Foundation should play a role in developing these standards. Internationally, there are a number of voluntary multi-stakeholder standards and investor-focused initiatives. The organizations behind these initiatives affirm that consolidation is required. They have welcomed the proposals to establish a new international sustainability standards board within the governance structure of the IFRS Foundation. And the shared ambition is to introduce a global baseline of standards for sustainability-related disclosures, which are focused on meeting the information needs of investors globally when assessing enterprise value. Enterprise value is a key concept designed to capture expected value creation for investors in the short, medium, and long term. And it is interdependent with value creation for society and environment. Actually, Randy Quarles quoted also that the new board would begin with the climate. Its work would be expected to move with pace to consider other sustainability-related issues important for enterprise value. But any further step would require investor needs and the support in global stakeholder consultations. And our approach to global standards is market and demand-led. The Foundation provides a setting where investors, regulators, companies, academics, and standardizers from around the world can work and problem solve together. Question about governance of IFRS has also been raised. Key part of the governance is a transparent and inclusive due process that is overseen by trustees. And the trustees are in turn accountable to the monitoring board of public authorities, and its membership includes IOSCO, the European Commission, the US Securities and Exchange Commission, and other authorities. Basel Committee and IOSCO are observers. Whilst the Foundation is responsible for the production of IFRS standards, individual jurisdictions retain the right to choose whether and how to incorporate the new standard into their own requirements. These governance arrangements have evolved over time. The trustees are currently consulting on further amendments to the governance and constitutional arrangements to accommodate the new Sustainability Standards Board. We welcome any suggestions for further enhancement. If the future is jurisdictional and international standards, the key question is how this can be reconciled. And I want to conclude just by saying that the approach advocated by IOSCO and others is to establish a global baseline of sustainability-related disclosure standards to meet investor needs, which would be made available for use by jurisdictions as a base for public policy needs. This approach would provide global comparability for investors in a way that allows jurisdictions to combine the global standards with their own additional requirements. And I actually agree with Paolo Gentiloni when he spoke today that to make this work will require political will, compromise, and flexibility from all parties. Success is by no means certain, but if you want global sustainability-related disclosures for investors, this offers a path. Thank you.
Thank you, Erkki. I think you rightly put the accent on comparability and on the compatibility that there needs to be between global standard and regional standards also. Otherwise, we've seen occasionally with accounting standards that can be, sometimes there can be a conflict, and that is quite troublesome. So there needs to be a reconciliation in sustainability-related matters, if I understood you correctly, to avoid a cacophony and to avoid further problems. Now, our next panelist comes to us via our connections. Hopefully she will appear shortly behind me. Here she is, Fernanda Necchio. I hope you can hear us fine. And
yes.
Fernanda is with the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and it's not unique. It's been mentioned that Carney was governor at two different central banks, but Fernanda has a different distinction. She has served in two different central banks, one in a developed economy and the other one in a major emerging market economy. So provides a bit of different perspective. She's at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, but she was also on the executive board of the Central Bank of Brazil, which is her native country. And so it has a very interesting perspective. We've already heard from President Lagarde and from Governor Visco earlier in an earlier session that climate change is important for central banks in terms of monetary policy, but also in terms of supervising banks and as a guardian of financial stability. I think it would be interesting to hear from you as you have this double experience on both sides of the divide, if I can put it this way. How you tackle this in both your jobs.
Great. Well, thank you very much for this nice introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for the invitation to participate on this panel. So I'm planning to give some brief remarks and really be very brief and focus on two main points, which first I'll talk about why climate change and the risks associated with it are important for central banks, and in fact, they are at the heart of central banks' mandate. And this is going to be a very important point as I go through my planned remarks. And then I'll finish by laying out the importance of research and good quality data to better understand and meet the challenges of a changing climate. I think this is a good time for me to start saying that my remarks reflect my own views and not those of my current employer, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and neither my previous employer, the Central Bank of Brazil. That said, in many ways, my views are shaped by having participated on the efforts to understand and mitigate climate risks and foster a greener financial system on these two very different central banks and economies. So turning to the first point, why are climate risks so important for central banks? And I think we heard a lot about that during this nice conference today. Well, first, most central banks are committed or mandated to keep inflation low and stable. To do so, the central banks conduct monetary policy based on current, future, and future economic conditions, inflation, and inflation expectations. Therefore, it is really important that central bankers understand the underlying mechanisms that determine economic conditions, how agents respond to risks and shocks, as well as how they respond to current and future changes to the economy. So central banks are forward-looking and need to follow closely and understand the nature of shocks hitting the economy, as well as the undergoing changes to households and business preferences, to consumer patterns, and changes to investment decisions. So those changes are going to be important drivers of economic conditions, trends in labor markets, and also have very important effects in relative prices. In the past few years, on top of the increasing number of extreme climate-related shocks, we have seen an increasing response of consumers, businesses, and investors as they adjust their preferences and behavior and adapt consumption and investment patterns to respond to current and future changes to climate conditions. So the shocks per se, but also the changes and adaptation of economic agents are bound to have impact on the economies worldwide, although in different ways, right? You can think that, for example, for emerging and more open economies, the effects can be felt stronger from changes in financial investor preferences, for example, while for larger and more closed economies, countries can be more heavily impacted by the responses of businesses and consumers. So in order to fulfill their mandates to keep inflation low and stable, central banks need to stay ahead of the curve, prepare for and understand the structural changes that their own economies and other economies are going through. Therefore, understanding changes to agents' behavior due to climate risks and how the transition to a newer equilibrium affects their economies is undeniably at the heart of central banks' objectives when conducting monetary policy. Some central banks also have mandates associated with safeguarding the stability of their financial system. As climate-related extreme events become more frequent, they put financial systems at risk, directly and indirectly, and climate risks and the response to it may change the demand for currency, the values of physical assets and collaterals, in addition to bringing high financial costs to the society. So once again, preparing and mitigating climate risks becomes an important task for regulators and supervisors. Note that everything that I've said so far are associated with climate risks having direct and indirect effects on the economy. And for those reasons, climate risk and climate change is a matter of interest for central banks. Understanding and laying out the appropriate responses are key for central banks to fulfill their mandate, irrespective of whether climate is explicitly stated in their mandates. The importance of better understanding the economic impact of climate change and how to respond to the economic changes induced by it brings to my second and last point, which relate to the roles of data and research. One of the main challenges to study the study of climate relates to bridging data gaps. We have observed changes to climate and the emergence of risks in the past few years, but we have yet to attain comparable data sets worldwide, converge on metrics to measure risks, and the responses from market participants. And very importantly, we have yet to measure to make sure that databases worldwide speak to one another. In addition, climate change is a global phenomenon, and in being so, it requires a strong international cooperation, information sharing, and consonance of data and metrics. These elements are going to be key for central banks going forward to better understand and respond to the challenges ahead. So what exactly can be done with data research? In the same very structured way that central banks worldwide rely on academic research to study and implement monetary policies, academic research on climate change should be the base and provide the stepping stones for the response of central banks going forward. A lively academic environment is key for providing fruitful discussions and for constructing a well-grounded response to climate change. Bridging data gaps and fostering the excellence in academic research is key to face the challenges ahead. With that in mind, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco is convening the best academic thinking on the topic, hosting conferences and sponsoring a seminar series on climate economics, featuring a wide range of research on these issues that stand before us. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco has also assembled a research team, which I am leading now, to study how these issues are likely to impact the Fed's mandate in the future. This team will allow central banks, the Fed, and also central banks worldwide to leverage our strength as students of the economy and to prepare for the challenges and uncertainty that lie ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it was important that you brought up the importance of bridging the data gap in terms of understanding the risk that come from from climate change. I forgot to mention, and I should have, that something that not many people know it, that the Central Bank of Brazil was voted by, surprisingly to me at least, by a group of NGOs active on the environment and the second best in the world in looking at these topics. And you were involved while at the Central Bank of Brazil and looking at the sustainability aspects of the banking supervision. As Brazil is such a crucial country when we talk about environmental problems and climate change, I wonder if you could tell us something about that, the reaction, the response of the banking sector there, which has some very important institutions to your efforts.
Sure. I don't know if you want me to respond right now or to come back later when we have a Q&A. So, I mean, I can...
Yeah, if you could answer that now.
All right. So I actually don't feel that it's surprising that the Central Bank of Brazil has a very comprehensive agenda on climate and the mitigating of social, environmental, and climate risks. In fact, you know, the Central Bank of Brazil was very, in some ways, pioneer in establishing regulatory and supervisory measures to try to mitigate and foster a greener financial system. But in last September, when I was still at the Central Bank of Brazil, the bank launched a very comprehensive agenda that included measures related to internal measures, policies, specific policies, partnerships, supervisory and regulatory measures. In very broad sense, all measures announced by the BCB are related to disclosure and mitigating the climate, social, and environmental risks. And turning straight to your question, the reception from the financial sector was actually very positive. I think, you know, it's a growing consensus in Brazil among the financial sector and among consumers as well. And that goes back to the type of changes in behavior that I was talking about a few minutes in my initial remarks. And there is a society, a demand from the society to foster a greener financial system in the country. And we saw with the launch of our agenda that the financial sector is really engaged and committed to responding in the best way to the regulatory measures that have been put in place and that are being put in place over the course of this year. I would also say that everything that has to do with the Brazilian agenda is available online. So if you want to read the details about all the measures announced, the deadlines, and how things have been evolving since the announcement, I would refer everyone to the banks, to the BCB's website to check it out. As much as I'm not part of the BCB anymore, I'm very proud of what they have been doing over there.
I'm sure you are. Our next is a testimony to our diversity. We can boast in our panel the only non-G20 speaker today, and also the only one from an African country. Lamia Merzuki is with the Casablanca Finance City Authority, and she also co-chairs the International Network of Financial Centers for Sustainability. And I think she can tell us a little bit about how can the low carbon transition shape financial institution markets in the context of developing emerging markets and developing economies, and exactly what you do as financial centers for sustainability.
Thank you, Alessandro. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking and congratulating the Italian G20 presidency for its continuous leadership and support. I mean, you have been instrumental in the FC4S launch 4 years ago within the framework of the G7 Italian presidency, and you have been continuously committed to the development of this network, including the African Regional Platform. So thank you for that. So the FC4S, the Financial Centers for Sustainability Network, is the network of the world's green financial centers born out of the G7 Italian presidency in partnership with the UN and today with the UNDP. It represents over 80% of the global equity markets with 36 financial centers in the world from across Europe, the Americas, Africa, Asia. And it was launched in African grounds in Casablanca with the signing of the Casablanca Declaration. So the purpose of this network is to mainstream green finance and to really to green the financial systems in every country. You know, there is a unique characteristic that a financial center offers. It's not only a network of banks or a network of insurance companies. It's the synergy of a whole ecosystem of actors, be it banks, insurance companies, asset managers, and even the supervisors, the regulators. So having said that, how this network is concretely contributing to the greening of the financial systems? Actually, this is done through multiple ways. The first way is by supporting the financial centers in their sustainable finance roadmap, and even sometimes helping the countries put in place their sustainable finance roadmap from scratch. But there is a process for that. So let me very briefly talk about a major tool that we have put in place in the FC4S, which is called the assessment program. This tool actually takes a form of a survey that we send once a year to the financial centers, members of the FC4S. And the purpose is to provide the financial centers with a baseline to track and measure their progress in terms of sustainability. So it gathers a lot of quantitative as well as qualitative data, and obviously here data is crucial. I mean, as it has already been said, if we manage to show the progress using data, then we could really make a real change and gain momentum. So obviously here the taxonomy issue is crucial. but we can discuss it later on. So once we gather all this information and analysis, then we can design a strategy and a sustainable finance roadmap. So this has been the case for many countries, and very recently with Malaysia, with Ireland. So for instance, the Irish Ministry of Finance is currently developing its first sustainable finance roadmap using the assessment tool, the FC4S assessment tool. We are also working in partnership with the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, and we have been developing an international stocktake on sustainable finance roadmap that will be like a guidebook for ministers of finance. So today, this tool is really becoming an unmatched global reference of where financial centers stand in terms of sustainability, both at the public and private sector levels. The second way to contribute to the greening of the financial system is through international cooperation and multilateral action. And here, I'd like to share what we're doing in Casablanca, in Africa. In Africa, because actually the first regional platform that was launched was that of Africa, and then we launched Europe, the Americas, Asia, and so on. Obviously, in Africa, the process was not that easy because, by and large, Africa is still at a very early stage of the sustainable finance transition. But the FC4S has made a special effort to agree a specific work program dedicated to Africa because it represents the weakest link in green finance, and yet it has the greatest potential to make massive leapfrogs in terms of sustainable development. So today I'm also representing Casablanca Finance City, which was at the origin of the FC4S African chapter, and we were the only member in the African continent. And today, 4 years later, we are six members in this FC4S African chapter, and I must say it has been a great learning experience with several partnerships. We have talked, it has been mentioned, ambition and cooperation, and this is, Africa, the FC4S African chapter is about international cooperation. Even bilateral cooperation. So for instance, Casablanca Finance City signed a partnership agreement with FC4S Lagos to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs, their respective SDGs. And what is unique in the FC4S is that it has been a catalyst for the emergence of new financial center bodies that adopted sustainability as a strategic priority in their DNA from the start, namely Abidjan, Lagos, Cairo. Lagos, the name of the financial center is FC4S Lagos, Financial Center for Sustainability Lagos. Obviously, sometimes it was very, very challenging because we have very diverse levels of development in terms of sustainable finance. And sometimes, to begin with, it was just about capacity building and raising the awareness in some countries, just raising the awareness and rallying the stakeholders around green finance, public as well as private, and explaining that the future of finance can only be green and sustainable. I have some, or maybe later on, just on the framework, standards, and so on, taxonomies. For sure, without harmonized framework, the mobilization of green investment flows is blocked and investors are lost. But at the same time, I believe it's important to identify and prepare for the possible unintended consequences of the convergence of the taxonomies. And here I'm talking about all the indirect impact that these standards, frameworks could have on developing countries. What could seem like an easy rule and framework to implement in a mature economy could end up jeopardizing a less mature economy. So I really think that we should consider regional specificities, and we believe that this can be done through the well-established international practice of international recognition, mutual recognition and technical equivalence. So for instance, finding an acceptable ratio for adapting sustainability standards to different countries in the world. you know, I'm in contact with many African countries that find it very difficult. Just as an example, we have some African countries that are still dependent on coal, okay? They are poor countries, they are the least pollutant, but they are still dependent on coal to produce electricity. But international reinsurers are reluctant to give any capacity, you know, and they find it so, I mean, they cannot afford a price too expensive. So it drives the country to a troublesome situation. So is it sustainable? Is this situation sustainable? I'm not sure. That is why I think that we should really work on adapting, you know, all these frameworks. I mean, I'm a fierce believer of rules, standards, and frameworks. All I'm saying is that we really need to adapt these frameworks to regional specificities, at least. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is why meetings like this are important, because they bring out voices that sometimes have difficulty in being heard, and bring out differences which are important, especially in the transition. And as almost everybody emphasized, the importance of having on board emerging markets and developing economies. This is a graphic representation of problems ahead and need to be tackled. We should once again have a panelist from the outer world, from some other orbit. Here you are, Dr. Majun. Is good afternoon. It's probably good evening to you, or good night, but you're the chair of the Green Finance Committee of the China Society for Finance and Banking, and you're also the co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group and a former central bank official. Thank you for joining us today. And we're keen on hearing from you on the work of the Sustainable Finance Working Group. As we've heard from the FSB, which I know you work closely with, but in your work, we'd like to hear about your work in developing a G20 roadmap on sustainable finance. I think this is one other instance where we see the importance of the G20. Climate change is clearly not an issue that can be solved by developed countries alone, and the fact that China co-chairs or a Chinese representative co-chairs this group, I think underlines the importance of the G20 effort. Dr. Majun, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very well, yes.
Great. Let me start by thanking the Minister of Finance and Central Bank of Italy for inviting me to join this very important forum. It's my great pleasure to be part of this discussion. As many speakers have touched upon the importance of green and sustainable finance, I will focus on my remarks on the question of how. Based on experiences of the past few years in the sustainable finance market, I think a well-functioning sustainable financial system will need to have at least 4 pillars. The first pillar is taxonomy. Taxonomies, which define what are sustainable activities, is the basis for all sustainable finance activities. Taxonomies can help prevent greenwashing and protect market integrity and provide a basis for green performance measurement and allocation of government incentives. There are several different approaches to developing such taxonomies, including the top-down approach, which was adopted by China, EU, and a few other countries, and bottom-up approach, which is used by climate bond standards. Of course, taxonomy is not only tool for aligning investments with SDGs. Its implementation requires the assistance of verification services and green or ESG rating methodologies. The second pillar is disclosure. Green and sustainable finance should deliver environmental and other benefits to SDGs. These benefits should be calculated and measured and reported in order to inform investors that are interested in investing in sustainable assets. As exposure to polluting and high carbon assets can generate financial risks to investors, such environmental and climate risks should also be measured and disclosed. In the past few years, many governments and regulators have introduced their environmental and climate-related disclosure requirements based on TCFD recommendations. The third pillar is incentives. Under the current pricing system, many sustainable investments are not fully compensated for their positive externalities, which leads to underinvestment, and many polluting and high carbon investments have attracted too much capital, as their negative externalities are not fully internalized. Therefore, public policy tools need to be used to overcome these externalities. These tools include emission trading schemes, carbon taxation, policies encouraging the use of clean energy and other low carbon activities, as well as green finance incentives. The fourth pillar is financial product innovation. A green financial system requires many products in order to meet the demands from different companies and projects. We need green loans, green bonds, green funds, green ABS, green ETF, green insurance, and carbon-related products. Each of them will play a role in supporting certain green and sustainable activities. A lot of progress has been made in the past few years in the sustainable finance market, especially in these four areas, which I call four pillars. The question for us is what the international coordination mechanisms, especially the G20, should do to further accelerate the pace of its development. This is exactly the question of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group is trying to answer. Over the past few months, this working group, re-established by Italian presidency and co-chaired by myself, representing PBOC, and Sharon Young, representing US Treasury, has held 2 official group meetings and many consultation meetings with private sector representatives and IOs. We have decided to produce 4 major deliverables this year. The first is a G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which will come up with recommendations on many of the issues I mentioned above. And this roadmap will guide the work of G20 for the coming few years. The second, third, and fourth items are topics the working group will work on this year, including approach to align investment with SDGs, sustainability reporting standards, and roles of MDBs in supporting the Paris Agreement. Let me just give you 2 examples on the issue that we need to have global coordination, including through the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. The first is about the approach to align investments with SDGs, which include taxonomies and ESG rating methodologies. One problem we're facing is that as many as 200 taxonomies have popped up over the past few years. This is equivalent to 200 languages used in the same market for communication, which creates market confusion and segmentation, increased verification costs, and potentially may lead to greenwashing. As for ESG rating, they are also facing the problem of too many inconsistent methodologies. The second example of issue that requires global coordination is sustainability reporting. There are many different types of reporting standards or proposals developed with different principles, different content requirements, and presentations. The proliferation of inconsistent reporting standards is also becoming a barrier to enhancing transparency and data availability. In the above-mentioned areas, we need to come up with solutions to improve coordination and consistency. For example, we can encourage developers of taxonomies to use the same industrial classification, encourage different jurisdictions to adopt common taxonomies on a voluntary basis, and encourage the development of unified regional taxonomy, just like what EU did for the European market. As for reporting, we should support the IFI's efforts to develop a globally accepted reporting standard with flexibility to accommodate jurisdictions and SME-specific requirements. I'm very hopeful that through our collective efforts, the Sustainable Finance Working Group will make concrete progress in the coming few months to forge consensus in many important areas that require global coordination. Thank you very much, and back to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think you touched on many questions that had popped up in the conversation earlier today, and there's one last point that you mentioned that I think it's worth repeating, and that's the treatment of SMEs, because of course these risk being left behind, and if not assisted in the transition, and these are the backbone of many economies, including the one in Italy and many others, and the question of proportionality and assistance will have to be taken into account. I don't want to rush things through, but we have time for some questions, and one comes from the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, who would like to take the floor, and I think I'll give the floor to her.
Thank you,
If she's
Alessandro, and
or to him, I'm
thank
sorry.
you for allowing me to speak here. This has been a very, very interesting panel. I think even the whole day, and I really want to thank also the Italian presidency for kind of organizing this day. This has been great. I think there's been a lot of kind of a general feeling that people agree with the same messages here, where we're really at an important juncture. If we want to get to net zero, we really have to act now. That's a really important aspect. We really need the private sector, and that's really the aspect of this panel. There's all this set of kind of what I'll call necessary conditions, and I think Marjane kind of covered quite a bit of that. We really need kind of proper pricing. We need disclosure. We need data. We need the taxonomy. These will not be easy aspects to get. At least in the Canadian case, we know a lot of parts where we're seeing different adjustments there. In the pricing part, we're moving forward with carbon pricing. But at the same time, the distributional aspects of that are very important. Even in a case like Canada, where we're using the revenues to kind of help redistribute, that doesn't mean it kind of works perfectly. I always think there's a big difference between suburbs and cities and different groups. We're actually we're trying to change behavior, and so certain types of behaviors are kind of basically being asked to do differently, and that means certain parts of the society are kind of being asked more. Disclosure is really an important piece there too. We're working very heavily on the disclosure in Canada, and right now we have a pilot project with a whole set of banks, insurance companies, pension funds. And as been discussed, this aspect of looking forward and trying to get forward-looking metrics, and we're exactly working with that. We're working with some of the scenario analysis from the NGFS to kind of try to prove that. It's turning out to be quite difficult, and it's actually very demanding on the institutions to do that. But I think we can kind of help that learning, and we're trying to move forward there. Data gaps is really one of the big things that has kind of been brought up. Again, there, I think has to be a big role in kind of getting the data to be shared across countries, and kind of hoping that we could treat some of that data like a public good. Also on taxonomy, we want to be ambitious. We want to kind of figure out things, but we have to be practical. And again, trying to figure out the right mix and thinking about some of the distribution aspects of some of those taxonomies, who will be hurt or not, and whether we'll keep enough social support. So those are all the things I think there's been a big agreement here in most of the presentations today, this aspect of pricing, disclosure, taxonomy. So my question for the panel is, are we missing something? Is that sufficient to kind of really concentrate on those elements and then let the private sector be able to kind of move forward financing if we're working on those? Or are there things that we're really missing there? Or is there subparts in those aspects that we are also missing? So that's my question for the panel.
Perhaps I could say, yeah.
Yes. Erkki, why don't you take that? And I think we've heard about the Canadian example today, and as a reference, and we heard also it's not all smooth sailing, but it's a first step. And then to the question of Deputy Governor Budry.
Of course, today we've discussed from the morning on this carbon tax issue. It was by Nordhaus, it was by others. I have in one of the slides of Professor Nordhaus was Finland on the top. It was the highest carbon tax, but not very large scope. I know a little bit about the history, because I happen to be finance minister who proposed that in 1988. So it was imposed from 1990. It still is there. It was the first of its kind. Why it was possible was that we at the same time had income tax reform. So we were able to balance these distributional impacts on income tax reform. I must just say that however positive approach people have to fight against climate change, these distributional aspects come into play relatively soon. So they must be at the same time properly handled. And I'm sure the Canadian friends have a lot of experience, and every single country needs to work on that. That's one issue. And second is then this leakage issue. This kind of question of climate club is, I think it's necessary. Bruegel, the European think tank, has made also a paper about that. I just agree. It's not a home run. It's an important project, and I agree with that. I think second issue, which is very important here for us, is to define the roles, who does what. That's why I think we must remember that, for instance, central banks have not a mandate from elected people to run climate policies. So it must be mainly done by governments who have legitimacy of the parliament. But then, of course, in their own remit, they have important roles for financial stability, how they impact in inflation forecasting, and so forth. For standard setters also, where they ask about our governance, what is your governments to take the issue up? I said, we are not setting up policy objectives. It comes from governments, from elected bodies. But we can propose tools and instruments to achieve those in the most efficient ways by using market mechanisms. But I think in this discussion, it's been a great day and great presentations, good papers, but still to have this structure, who does what, who is responsible for what part, and still not forgetting the areas, Africa, different circumstances. SMEs has been a very powerful case here. Larry Fink spoke about private companies also. We also need to think about its breadth, not to focus too narrowly on public companies, because otherwise you lose such a big part of the economy. But maybe others too, but it's been great, absolutely great day. Still, I said, William Nordhaus' presentation, brief, well-structured, all the key points were there. That was a great start for the day.
Thank you, Erkki. We have another question online comes from Kevin Gallagher. It's a question for Ms. Necchio, who underlined the need for global surveillance and coordination. And he's asking, I hope Fernanda Necchio is still with us. He asked, the NGFS is pioneering efforts in assessing future climate risks. Could the IMF extend its role and take into account these progresses to upgrade its role as a financial supervisor? So I assume he means upgrade its role as a financial supervisor to take into account climate risk as a financial risk. I hope Ms. Necchio is still with us.
Yes, I'm here. So okay. I think, well, first, the NGFS has a key role in this global effort and actually bringing awareness and providing tools for, particularly for smaller economies to handle the effects of a changing climate. I believe the IMF has been increasing as well its efforts in the discussions associated with climate change and the effects on the economy. And I believe we're going to be seeing more and more of that going forward. So because the efforts regarding climate have to be from a global perspective, international organizations are going to be key here in trying to coordinate the responses and also setting patterns and directions for countries to move forward. So I think the IMF is one that is going to play an important role as well.
Thank you. Indeed, we've had a very bullish message in terms of involvement of the IMF from its managing director earlier today. We're fast running out of time. I don't know if there's any questions from the room. Otherwise, instead of trying to draw conclusions, which of course will be left to Italian Minister Daniele Franco right after this panel, I just wanted to ask Mr. Donnet, this time donning his hat as residents of Venice and CEO of Generali rather than spokesman for this alliance of insurers, because I know Generali is sort of making Venice as a center for sustainability studies. Maybe he can tell us a little bit more about that, and then after that we'll hear from Minister Franco.
Thank you. Yes, as you know, as Generali, we share with the city of Venice the same symbol, which is the winged lion of San Marco, and this is really important to us. Venice celebrates this year its 1,600th years anniversary, and in the same year as Generali, we celebrate our 190th anniversary, which means for us 119 years of presence in Venice. So Venice has a special place in our long history, in our company, and obviously in our heart. But the place of Venice for us is not only in the past, in our history, in our heritage. Venice is also part of our future. Venice has a special place in the world, and everything which happens in Venice happened to the whole world. So this is the reason why we decided a couple of years ago to revitalize the San Marco area, doing with two sustainable initiatives. The first one was to bring back to life the royal gardens, the Giardini Reali, which are between the Laguna and the San Marco Square, and they had been abandoned for hundreds of years, and they are now a green, relaxing heaven open to Venice citizens and Venice visitors. The second initiative is the restoration of the iconic building of Procuratie Vecchie. Maybe you have seen it on San Marco Square. It's a huge building, still under construction, under restoration. We will host in this building the head office of the Human Safety Net, which is our social initiative to unlock the potential of people living in vulnerable circumstances, because we believe that a sustainable world is also a more inclusive world. So we wanted to make those two initiatives together, because we are convinced that fighting against climate change and fighting for a more inclusive growth is the same thing. It's the same fight. And I think to win this battle, we all need to raise our sense of responsibility, our level of awareness, and our level of consciousness. This is exactly what the story of Venice have taught us during hundreds of histories, and I think that this is exactly what the G20 has just been doing. Thank you.
Well, indeed, if there is a prime example of the threat from climate change and the need to act on it, is definitely the fate of Venice, and I think it was very appropriate that the G20, and in particular this conference, was held here. I now give the floor to Minister Daniele Franco for the conclusion of this conference.
So thanks for this very interesting and lively panel, also for the diversity of point of view that have added richness to the discussion. So Minister Daniele Franco will conclude our conference after this. This was the last panel in our program. Let me just thank everybody on stage, in the audience, and online for the rich contributions that I think have made this conference extremely interesting on a subject that, I dare say, will define our generations in the eyes of the next ones. Daniele, floor is yours.
Thank you, Federico. And I think it's time to conclude today's long discussions, which I believe have been rich and diversified. I believe that the academic proposals, the analysis developed by international organizations, as well as the commitments and the best practices from the public and the financial sectors, will all be useful to lay the foundation for a stronger international climate action. They will help G20 policymakers in developing a better coordinated policy response. And hopefully they will set the stage for a successful COP26 next autumn. I think we all understand, especially after today, that achieving net zero is complex and challenging and requires a flexible strategy that takes account of the differences between advanced and emerging and less developed economies. We need to complement policies and regulatory action with well-designed market-based mechanisms. We need to use all the instruments at our disposal to achieve our goals in a smooth and in an efficient way, minimizing the cost of the transition, the effects on the most vulnerable part of the population, the most vulnerable countries, and the risks for the financial system. I thank the international partners who provided an exhaustive overview of the appropriate policy mix to achieve net zero targets. A comprehensive strategy is crucial to promote a global just transition and make our economies resource efficient and competitive. The three key elements of a comprehensive approach should be, first, green investments and innovation. Second, fiscal and market-based mechanisms such as carbon pricing to get the price right and incorporate climate externalities. Third, support to the most vulnerable to accelerate the green transition and make it more inclusive and politically viable. Actually, the recovery from the pandemic is a one-time chance to promote a paradigm shift to transform our economies. All countries should be part of the green transition, but as we saw also today, achieving net zero is more demanding for emerging markets and developing economies, which face an increase in demand for energy driven by both industrialization and rising consumption. I think Lamia made this point earlier on very clearly. The role of multinational development banks is strategic for supporting transition in these countries. Furthermore, the conference has made us even more aware that climate action needs closer cooperation between public and private institutions. Regulatory and supervisory frameworks are very important to encourage the private sector in supporting innovative investments and technologies. Let me conclude by saying a few words on behalf of the G20 presidency. This conference will be essential to feed and enrich the next G20 discussions. As you know, the Italian G20 presidency has put since its beginning the protection of the planet at the core of the finance track debate. We relaunched the Sustainable Finance Study Group, and as you know, we have two co-chairs, the United States and China, and we are very happy about that. And we will soon discuss the roadmap of the study group for the coming years. Last April, in the update of the G20 Action Plan, the most significant innovation was the introduction of a fourth pillar dedicated to protecting the planet. Yesterday, the G20 signed a communiqué with several important commitments. G20 members agreed that a closer international coordination on climate action is critical. We have committed to continuing discussing the best policy mix to shape a just and orderly transition. We have also concurred that support should be granted to the poorest and the most vulnerable. We have encouraged multilateral development banks to step up their effort to pursue alignment with the Paris Agreement within ambitious timeframes. Finally, we have stressed that international climate finance is critical for supporting developing countries' climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts. I'm confident that this conference is serving its intended purpose, building the political momentum to make sure that climate change remains on top of the global agenda, including the future G20 works, shaping the right path toward a successful COP26. Distinguished guests, eminent participants, allow me to thank you again for having shared your insightful views and experiences and for having made this conference a success. Finally, I would like to thank all those who have helped us organizing today's conference, but I would say the last 3 days of meetings in Venice. I would like to thank the local authorities and all the colleagues from the Bank of Italy and the Ministry of the Economy and Finance. I mean, you all did really a great job. So thank you very much. And also thank you very much and also, finally, thank you very much for arranging a great weather. Having said that, I'll close my conclusions, and now let us focus on tonight's match. All the best.